Processing options. So, when we are processing the cube, when we were processing dimensions and measure groups, we saw analysis services giving different options, right. For example, we always picked default. If I go to the analysis services project, give me 1 second. And then when I say process, when I say process in the cube, I see this wizard where it gives a processing options. In the processing options, it gives multiple options depending on what you are processing. Okay. So, when we are processing the cube, it shows process default, process full, data structure, index, add, like this the options. Similarly, if I go to a dimension, let us say if I go to date dimension and try to process, it shows different options: process default, full, clear, data, index, update. Okay. So, depending on the object within the cube that we are trying to process, analysis services gives different options. So, we will see what are those options and when to use what. So, process default is a default option we generally get when you are processing a cube, dimensions, databases, measure groups, mining models and all partitions. Okay. So, this one detects the process state of database object and performs the processing. That means, depending on the state of the object, analysis services determines what kind of processing it needs to do. So, instead of we deciding what kind of processing, analysis services does it for us. So, if you do not know what kind of processing you want to do, you can go with process default. And then process full. Process full applies to cubes, databases, dimensions, measure groups and partitions. Okay. Process full, what does it do? Process full, all the objects that it contains. When a process full is executed against an object, analysis services drops all data of the object and then processes the object. That means, it drops, it cleans up the data file within the analysis services. It cleans up the data, existing data, and reprocesses the data. That means, rearranges the data in the data files. Process clear, it applies to cubes, databases, dimensions and all the objects. What it does? It drops the data in the object and it basically clears. The clear means it drops the data, it does not do anything, it just cleans out. Okay. And process data. Process data applies to dimensions, cubes and measure groups and partitions. Processes data only without building aggregations. So, when I said process, analysis services gets the data from SQL server and then builds the aggregations. Okay, that is why analysis services is faster, right. It builds the aggregations. When we say process data, it only processes the data. That means, it only queries the data based on the DSV you have and it does not build any aggregations after that. Okay. Process add, for the dimensions, adds new members and updates the dimension attribute captions and descriptions. For measure groups, partitions, adds newly available fact data and process only to the relevant partitions. That means, process add is used when you want to add new data. Let us say you are getting data every day from the source. So, once you process the data in your dimension, you want to add the data. That means, you are always expecting new data into the table. You are not expecting updates to the existing data. That means, you are not expecting changes to the existing data. Instead, you are daily getting new records. So, when you get new records and you know that there is no change to the existing data, you go with process add. When you say process add, it is like insert statement, always no updates, it will just keeps adding the new data into the dimension. Process update forces a reread of data and an update of the dimension. That means, when you do process update, analysis services does insert and update. That means, if there is a new record, it will insert, and if there is old record, already existing record, and if there is a change, it updates the existing dimension data in the analysis services. Again, this is not in the SQL. Process index. So, analysis services also maintains indexes, we discussed in the earlier sessions. When we are creating the builds, when we are creating the cubes, analysis services creates aggregations and indexes. So, when we say process index, analysis services processes the index, that means it updates the indexes or recreates the indexes. Process structure. So, when we do process structure, analysis services does not deal with the data, it will just rearranges the structure. For the structure is nothing but your Visual Studio that configuration, dimensions, facts, cube configuration. So, it basically restructures the cube or cube database, but it does not access the data. That means, it does not query the databases or it does not build the aggregations. So, for example, if I go to my analysis services and if I say process, not here. So, process structure applies to cubes and mining structures. So, in our case cubes, right click process, and here if I say process structure, click OK. So, here if you see, it did not read any data. Okay, there are no select statement, there is no reading happening to from the SQL. So, it is not reading any data from the server. Instead, what it is doing, whatever we deployed, so this structure we deployed, right, this cube. So, whatever we deployed, it basically restructures, rearranges the structure in the server. So, that is what it does. So, when you are let us say you are developing a cube and you are not yet ready to validate the data, you are still validating how the cube looks, how the dimension looks, how the hierarchy looks, and those kind of stuff. So, when you want to debug or when you want to test only the structure, instead of processing the whole cube, you can just say process structure. Let us say you have billion records in the SQL table. Okay. If you are processing the cube, what it needs to do, it needs to read all the billion records and load into the cube. When you are not ready to test the data and you are just testing the structure of the data, structure of the cube, like hierarchies, levels and all, you do not need to do a full process or process update, because you do not want to get the data yet, you are just seeing the structure. In that case, you go with process structure. Okay. So, those are processing options. Most of the times we go with process default, because we want or we let analysis services decide what is the best processing option for that instance. So, if the cube dimension, let us say dimension, right, if the cube dimension was already processed, analysis services picks process update. If let us say the cube was never processed and this is the first time we are processing, analysis services picks process full. So, when you say process default, depending on the previous processing state, analysis services determines which way to go. So, that is why we generally prefer process default, but if let us say you are very familiar with the processing options, how exactly analysis services is processing, then you will go to a specific processing options. because when you do specific processing options, you may get better performance. So, for example, the scenario what we are talking, right, the source gives always new records, there is no change to the existing record, and you can never expect a change to the existing record, it is always new records. So, if you ask analysis services to pick the optimal processing option, analysis services does not know that source does not give changes to the existing data, right. So, in that case what happens, analysis services picks process update, which basically scans through the existing data and scans through the new data to see if there are any changes to the existing data versus any new data, right. So, it has to do all that, but when you know exactly that there won't be any changes to the existing data, you do not want to do process update, you can just pick process add. Process add will just add the new records to the existing dimension. So, like that, if you know or if you are familiar with this different processing options, you can directly use those options instead of letting analysis services decide. If you are not familiar with this processing options and if you don't want to take risk, you go with process default, where you let analysis services decide what kind of processing to do. Okay. So, these are processing options, and generally when you are building a framework to process different cubes, you need to be familiar with the different processing options. Otherwise, if you are just processing the whole cube or whole dimensions, you do just go with process default.